The real Jesus. And we're looking through the book of Luke, and this is a book in the New Testament, in the Bible, that's all about Jesus. And what we're doing in this part of the sermon series is we're looking at all the stories of what happened in Jesus' life. And as we look at those stories, we're going to say with each one, we're looking at them and saying, who is this Jesus? What can we learn about who he actually is from this story? And we've learned a lot of things about him. We've learned that he is the Son of God, the promised Messiah, a man of incredible power. Just his presence changes the world around him, and it changes people who really experience his presence. We started to learn last week, as we got into Luke chapter 5, a little bit about what was he about? What was most important to Jesus? And we saw that even though he was walking around doing amazing things, Jesus did some astonishing miracles. He would heal people. He raised people from the dead. He walked on water. But what was most important to him was that people would have their sins forgiven. That people would be brought back into a right relationship with God. You heard Pastor Philip last week talking about that story where these guys bring a paralytic, a guy who's paralyzed. They lower him through the roof of a house to Jesus, and instead of healing him first, what does Jesus do? He forgives his sins first, because that's the most important thing that can ever happen to this person. He can be brought back into a relationship with God. Now this week we're going to look at 3 different stories. And in these 3 stories we're going to see more about what is this mission that Jesus is on. What is it that is so important to him? It's, yes, that people would have their sins forgiven, but that's actually just one piece of the full mission that Jesus is on. Jesus is on a mission to save the world, to save human lives. From what? We'll see as we go through the stories. And we'll see Jesus arguing with a number of people here. But first, we need to get to, so here's the main point that I want to get across in today's message. The main point, we're going to be in Luke chapter 5, the end of the chapter, and a little bit of the beginning of Luke chapter 6. And here's the main point is this. Jesus is all about radical restoration of human lives. And he will let nothing stand in the way. He will let nothing stand in the way of that mission. This is what Jesus is all about, radical restoration of human lives. That means restoration of a human life all the way down to its deepest place. Somebody said to me, actually a stranger said to me last week, they said, as I look around in the world, all I see is darkness. Often we spend our time in our culture throwing up little lights, kind of like we do at Christmas time. We throw up lights so that it's not so dark and we can be happy in a physically dark time of year. But in our culture, we throw up lots of things and say, oh, the world really isn't so bad. Human beings really aren't so messed up. Look, there's all these good things, but really, that's all just on the surface. And underneath, the world is actually a very dark place, full of brokenness and death. And human beings, all of us, are very messed up at a deep level. And Jesus is all about the restoration of human lives, the radical restoration of human lives. And this is actually the same thing that we're about here at Community of Hope Church, because we are followers of Jesus. We think he is the best person who has ever lived. We think he is the one, we know he is the one who came to allow us to have a relationship with God. And through that relationship, human beings, human lives can really be restored. Jesus died on the cross so that you could be forgiven of your sins, enter a relationship with God that will, over time, restore you into what God created you to be. That's what we're all about. And so the way that we say it here at Community of Hope is, our purpose is, now you all say it at once, from memory, in loud, resounding, booming voice. That's right. What we're about here is we're about helping people grow in their relationship with God and with each other. That was actually really good. We're getting better at this. Oh, my goodness. I forgot I put it on the PowerPoint. All right, good job, Anna. Thank you. That was really good. But you know what? There's a lot of people in the church who can quote it from memory now. And somebody said to me this last week, We should put that on a t-shirt. Amen. We should put that on a t-shirt. Not because we want to just be reciting the same thing for no apparent reason, but because we want to remind ourselves of what our purpose is. This is of the utmost, the highest importance, that we don't forget what is our mission, what is our goal. I want you guys to say it, not even primarily so that you'll keep on doing it. Remind me what the purpose is. It's so easy to get distracted from the purpose, as we're going to see today. Jesus arguing with some Pharisees. All right, so he's going to argue with the Pharisees, and this is going to happen a number of times in this book of Luke. And so before we get into the actual story, we need to say a little bit of something about what is a Pharisee. Because if you haven't grown up in church, if you're not used to the Bible, you probably don't know what a Pharisee is. That's a weird word. So we're going to say a little bit about what is a Pharisee. We're going to see in these chapters today, Jesus is arguing a bunch of times with the Pharisees. And sometimes we might get the impression, because he's always arguing with the Pharisees, we might get the impression that that's because the Pharisees are really the worst guys out there. They're so terrible. That's why Jesus is always arguing with them. Actually, they were probably the people who were closest to the belief system that Jesus had. And that's why he argues with them so often. The other people who are, not even Jews, or the Sadducees, another group of Jews who are even further out, they don't even believe the Scripture, the Old Testament, Jesus doesn't have a lot of arguments with them because they're so far from what he thinks is true, what he knows is true. And so this is often, you argue with the people that you're closest to the most. How many of you argue with your family more often than you argue with anybody else? This is exactly what's happening with the Pharisees. So a little word about the Pharisees. They're not the worst guys ever, but they are on the wrong track, and Jesus is trying to put them back on the right track. What had happened with the Jewish nation, with the people of God, the people of Israel, is that in the period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's about 400 years there where there's no books of the Bible written. And in that period, the Greek culture had come in, and it had strongly influenced. You heard Alexander the Great. He came in, strongly influenced the whole known world at that time, the whole Middle Eastern and Mediterranean world. And so many of the Jewish people had been influenced in that direction. And they had stopped following God in the prescribed ways, the ways that the Old Testament said. And many of the Jewish people, especially the Sadducees, this other group, had stopped even believing the Bible. They'd stopped believing that it was really literally true. They stopped believing that there would be a resurrection of the dead. They stopped believing that there really were, spiritual beings out there. They had started to sort of, maybe the Bible is not literally true, or maybe it's not straightforwardly true. Maybe it's just all metaphor, something like that. This is a similar story to many groups today, isn't it? And the Pharisees, in the early part of, in the first couple hundred years before Christ, they were a renewal movement. They were a movement of Jewish people who said, no, we're going back to what's true. We believe that the Bible is true. We believe that God is real. We believe that he answers prayer. We believe that we have to seek hard after him. We believe that God is on a mission in the world, and we want to be on that mission too. Does that sound familiar? It's actually very similar. Their renewal movement has a lot of similarities to a lot of Christian renewal movements in the last couple hundred years, right? If you know what the word evangelical means. We are evangelical Christians. And the Pharisees actually have a lot of similarities to evangelical Christians. But the problem with the Pharisees is that as time went on, they had a lot of success, and many of the common people started following them. But as time went on, they began to focus more on the way they had always done things than on the actual mission of bringing people back to God, of restoring souls and human lives. They started to focus more on what had worked in the past, and we've just got to keep doing that, instead of what is God doing now and how do we best help people. And this is what Jesus runs into them head to head with. We see Jesus here. The title of the message today is Lead, Follow, or Get Out of the Way. And we see this attitude in Jesus. Jesus is about restoring human lives, and he's not going to let anything stand in the way. And you're going to see he actually is doing that in these chapters, and people keep trying to stop him. Jesus walks around restoring human lives, and people, religious people, people who go to church all the time and say that they want to follow God, they try to stop him. So let's jump into the first of these three stories. And the first story I'm going to call A Party with Tax Collectors, all right? A party with tax collectors. And you can see I got a picture of some partiers up there. How many of you would go to a party like that? A party with lots of drinking and lots of crazy dancing. You don't have to raise your hands. I'm not asking you to. How many? Maybe there's even some drugs at the party. How many of you would go to a party like that? Probably not many of us. Maybe none of us who are in this room. Okay, so here's the story. Tax collectors, without getting too much into what these guys are, when we read tax collectors in the New Testament, we got to read people who are doing a lot of really bad stuff. Okay? We don't think of tax collectors as that bad today, but think of maybe the best way to think of it would be people who are in the mafia or a gang or some kind of organized crime is maybe the best way for us to quickly get at the way that people in the first century thought about tax collectors. These people extorted money from the people around them, and they were traitors to their own nation, working for the Romans who were oppressing everyone. Okay, so tax collectors are really bad guys. And so here's what happens in the end of Luke chapter 5. We'll start at verse 27 here. So Jesus, he goes out and he sees a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax collecting booth. So he's there extorting money from people. And he says to this Levi, "Follow me." We don't know if he says anything more than that. Maybe he met Levi before, very likely. But Levi decides to give up tax collecting. He leaves the gang and he follows Jesus. He leaves everything behind. Levi got up, left everything behind, and followed Jesus. Levi was also known by the name of Matthew. Levi is Matthew, the guy who wrote the book of Matthew. He becomes one of the apostles. Right after this, so this is amazing transformation that happens in Levi's life. Levi has left the gang that he was part of. He's ready to follow Jesus with everything. Right after this, Levi does what he knows to do. So remember, he's just left the mafia, but he's still, that's who he is. That's what he knows. And so he throws a big party for all the tax collectors so they can come and meet Jesus. So he throws a big party for the whole mob or for the whole gang, all his gang member buddies. Levi held a great banquet for Jesus, verse 29, at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors, gang members, and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and teachers of the law who belonged to their sect, they complained to Jesus' disciples. And they said, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" So here we have the first story. Something amazing is happening. Now, if you had gone up to any of the Pharisees and said, just think what would happen today. If you came up to any pastor and you said, "Would you like it if a really notorious gang member gave his life to Christ and was completely transformed?" What would a pastor say in answer to that question? Yes, of course I want that to happen. And the Pharisees would have said the same thing. But when they see this big crazy party, we don't know exactly what's happening at this party, but we can assume there's probably some bad stuff happening at this party. And Jesus is there in the midst of it. And when they see that, they look down on it and they actually try to stop it. Now, this is not something that just happened a long time ago that doesn't have anything to do with us. But this is something that happens all the time in the church today, around the church. And this is something we constantly have to be on guard of. God is doing something powerful in someone's life, and because it doesn't look the way that we expect it to, we try to shut it down. I have seen this happen over and over again, and I'm sure many of you have as well. Many of us even have been part of the ones trying to shut it down sometimes. So this is the first story, and what I want us to get out of this story, the party with the tax collectors, is this, that our beliefs about certain kinds of people cannot stand in the way of the mission. The mission that Jesus is on is to restore human lives. This is the most important mission in the world. Would you agree with that? There is nothing more important than the radical transformation of all the stuff that's wrong in human beings. That is the battle that's going on in the entire world, an unseen battle. And it is the most important thing of all. And we cannot allow our beliefs about certain kinds of people, whatever that is, whether that's what they've done in the past, whether that's the group that they identify with, whether that's their race, whatever that is, whether that's someone who's hurt me in the past and so I actually don't want to see them doing well. We can never allow our beliefs or our feelings about certain kinds of people to stand in the way of the mission that Jesus is on and the mission that we claim that we are on, the mission that we really want to be on with him. Let's jump to the second story. The second story I'm calling New Wineskins. And this story is the same thing. In all three of these stories, you're going to see the pattern that something incredibly good is happening, and people come and try to stop it. Not bad people, religious people who claim to follow God come and try to stop the good thing that is happening. Let's look here, starting at verse 33 in Luke chapter 5. This is what happens. Some of the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, they come to Jesus and they say this to him. They say, John's disciples, so that's John the Baptist. We talked about him at the beginning of this sermon series. John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin, and he led sort of a revival movement in Israel in those days. John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. But your disciples, Jesus, they go on eating and drinking. And Jesus answered, can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and in those days they will fast. Now, there's a couple things that I need to point out here. And the first one, let's go a little bit backwards. Let's look at verse 34 first. Jesus' answer to them. They're questioning how Jesus' disciples are acting, how they're living their lives. And Jesus answers by asking whether you can make the companions of a bridegroom fast. Now, we don't understand maybe all of those words right away. What is a bridegroom? That's the groom in a wedding, right? And so the image that Jesus is calling up here is one of, I don't know, the party that you have, what is that called? A stag party, right? The party that the groom and his wedding party have before he gets married. These guys are partying. So what do we see here about Jesus and his disciples? What was it like to be part of his discipleship team? It was like, in Jesus' own illustration here, not like a bad stag party, but it was joyful, like a party. These guys, we know that they were praying actually an incredible amount, but they were praying not because they felt like they had to or because they were following some rule. They were actually deeply in prayer, staying up all night in prayer sometimes because they wanted to pray and to be with Jesus in that way so much. To be part of Jesus' ministry team, to be one of his disciples, was joy and it was exciting. And that's what these guys felt like. And what the Pharisees are actually coming up to him and asking him, they're not just asking, because they ask, why don't your disciples fast and pray? Well, his disciples are praying a ton. But they're not praying according to the regular rules of prayer that had been implemented by the Pharisees and by John's disciples, by John. So in those days, many people said, it's a good thing to pray, and this is true. So when we have a good thing that we want to put into our lives, it often helps to have a routine, doesn't it? So how many of you pray, according to a routine, like at the same time of day every day? That's actually a really good thing to put into place, because then it makes sure that you do it. But this had been added to over the years, again and again, until you had set times of prayer throughout the day. And that's not wrong. That actually can be a really good way to do it. But, the Pharisees, they prayed at 9 in the morning, and then they prayed at noon, and then they prayed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it was like ticking off a box. They weren't praying because they were full of love for God and so excited to go pray. They were praying because they had to pray at these set times. And they were fasting not because they were seeking God with all of their heart, but because Pharisees always fasted on Monday and Thursday. That's just what you do if you're a Pharisee. You don't eat on those days until it gets dark. And then you say, well, I'm a good Pharisee because I've done this. And Jesus says, first of all, my disciples have me with them, and so they are full of joy. They're not going to fast right now. I couldn't make them fast if I tried. Later on, they'll fast because there'll be lots of things to cry out to God for throughout the rest of history. But right now, they're gonna rejoice with me, and they're going to jump on this exciting adventure that I'm leading. And my disciples aren't going to pray at 9 and 12 and 3 o'clock like they have to. My disciples are praying constantly because they love God and they're so excited about what God is doing. But all the Pharisees can see, look at something amazing is happening here. You have a group of people who are excited to pray and to follow Jesus on his mission. But instead of jumping on board with that, the Pharisees look at it and say, well, you're not doing it the way that we used to do it, the way that we've always done it, and so it must be wrong. And so what we have here again is something amazing happening. Jesus restoring human lives, and people, religious people, trying to shut it down because it doesn't look the way that they expect it to look. It doesn't look like it did 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, before you came, Jesus. The way we have always done things cannot stand in the way of the mission. This is our takeaway from story number 2. And this is extremely important. This is actually one of our core values here at Community of Hope Church, is that we always want to stick to the truth of the Bible, the mission of Jesus, but we cannot let the way we have always done things be the way that we always must do them, to the point where it stands in the way of the mission that God is calling us to. The most important thing above everything else is that people would actually be radically transformed in their inner depths. The most important thing is that this would really happen, that people would grow in their relationship with God and with each other. If that doesn't happen, then all the other stuff that we do is absolutely, completely a waste of time and useless. I mean, hear me here. We are only 10 years old as a church, but we have a way that we do things, don't we? We have the stuff that we've already done already. And it's not bad stuff. The stuff that the Pharisees were doing was not bad stuff. It's not bad to pray 5 times a day. That's not bad. But the question is this: are we still committed primarily to the mission or to the way that we've always done things? And as soon as that way that we've always done things starts to get in the way of the mission, we got to drop it immediately. If we keep on having, for the next 20 years, if we always have summer fun at the park, and we always have bowling, and we always have Sunday morning service, and we always have Christmas dessert theater, we always have all of those things, but no one grows in their relationship with God and with each other, we have totally failed. Would you agree with that? We have totally failed if that doesn't happen. And so it's not that those things are bad. We do them for that purpose, but we've got to lightning focus and always remind each other why we're doing these things. I'm walking into this event or this thing on Sunday morning or this community group. Why am I here? So that I can grow, so that others can grow, become closer to God, so that people can really be transformed, so that I can be on that mission with Jesus. Let's go to the third story here. This story we're going to call Lord of the Sabbath. Lord of the Sabbath. I got a picture of perfect children in church. Look at those children in church. They are perfect. Well, number one, they're all girls, and they're all sitting there perfectly with that praying during the whole service, and they're not talking, they're not messing anything up. They are perfectly attentive to God. Oh my goodness, those are the perfect children in church. If only we could force all of our children and all of our people to be exactly like that. What's that? Yeah, boys that age can't do that. Very few of them can. Very few. I could do that when I was that age, but I'm weird. Just ask anybody. Okay, so Lord of the Sabbath. So this story is about church. All right, the Sabbath was Saturday. This was the Jewish holy day, the day that they went to synagogue, the day they had church. And that day was special. It was set aside. It was holy. You couldn't do any work on that day. And this was something that God had given to the Jewish people, right? How many of us, you guys know that you need to have rest in your lives? We don't have a law anymore or a rule that you must follow that a certain day of the week you can't do any work. But if you work straight through 7 days of the week, you're wrecking your life and your soul. That's a sermon for another day. But don't do it, okay? So this was something that God had given to the Jewish people so that they didn't work straight through 7 days a week. And it was a rule. You got to, on this day, you're going to spend time focused on God. You're going to spend time with family. You're going to rest. All right? And there had grown up a lot of rules around this about, exactly how do we do that? What counts as work? What doesn't count as work? And what we have in the beginning of chapter 6 is Jesus fighting with the Pharisees over what counts as work and what doesn't. All right, so let me read a little bit of this story. So one Sabbath day, Jesus was going through the grain field. So he's walking through a field of wheat, and the wheat is almost ripe, and it's on church day. It's on Saturday. And his disciples began to pick some heads of grain and rub them in their hands and eat the kernels. So they were grabbing this off the plant and they were eating it, right? So they were just having a little snack, or maybe this was their lunch, something like that. And this was actually against not any laws that were in the Bible, but some rules that the Jewish people had come up with about how do we actually do our church day. We don't want to do any kind of work, so make sure you don't, thresh any grain, right? You don't take grain, you don't knock it off of the stalk, you don't grind it, you don't get rid of the chaff, you don't do any of that, even in a small amount on that day. This was so that people didn't, accidentally do work or were tempted to do work. But Jesus is allowing his disciples to do it. And they come to him and they say, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath, on this special church day?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did?" And I don't have the rest of the verse up there, but basically what David did is he broke some laws of the Old Testament because he and his companions were on a mission. David had been, in a certain story in the Bible, David had been on a mission with some soldiers, and this was a super important mission. And because of the mission, they didn't have any food, and so they ate some food that had been consecrated for the temple. And according to the rule of the Bible, they weren't supposed to eat it. But David did it anyway, and he even gave it to his companions. What Jesus is saying here is, me and my disciples, we're on a mission, and the mission is the most important thing. The mission is the most important thing, not a rule. And so then Jesus says this to them. Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man," and by that he's referring to himself, "is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, we talked about this in a sermon earlier. Jesus has made the claim that he is the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one of God, who is actually the Son of God, equal to God himself. And here he's making the claim again. Even this rule that God's given to the people of Israel, I'm actually in command over this rule. And I decide when it should be applied and when it shouldn't. This is a crazy statement, except that he's right. So he says this, and then he goes on to create a situation that dramatically teaches or tries to teach these crazy Pharisees who are all focused on the rules and not focused on the mission, what they should be doing. On another Sabbath, verse 6, Jesus went into a synagogue. So he goes to church on a Saturday. And he began teaching, and there was a man there whose hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they were already looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal the man on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand up in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. So here Jesus is confronting another rule. They had all these rules about a rest day, right, about the Sabbath. And one of the rules is you couldn't actually heal people. If you were a healer, either a spiritual healer or a doctor, you couldn't do that work unless it was a matter of life or death. Unless it was this person is going to die if they're not helped right now. So first aid, unless it was first aid, a matter of life or death, you couldn't do your work of healing on that special church day because this was a day of rest. And so what Jesus does is he goes and he grabs a guy who's not in a situation of life or death. He's just a guy who's got a shriveled hand, a withered hand, like maybe a club arm, something like that. And he brings him in the middle of church. He brings him right up in the middle of the service, in the church service. And he confronts all these Pharisees who are looking at him thinking that he's about to break the rule, and he is about to break the rule. And here's what he says in this situation. I ask you, which is lawful? Which is the right thing to do on the Sabbath, on a day of church? Which is the right thing to do? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy it? Now notice a couple of things here. First, Jesus is galvanizing everyone in the room back to the mission, or at least he's trying to. The mission is that we're going to save people. We're going to restore human lives. That includes their body, that includes their soul, that includes their mental health, their relationships. That's what we're about. And that's what this Sunday thing that we're doing, what that Saturday thing that they were doing, that's what it was actually for. And they've gotten so caught up on what should we be doing on this day? Let's do what we've always done. These are our traditions, that they've forgotten about the mission. They forgot what church was for. And Jesus brings them right back to it. Look, this guy is hurt. And here we see that the Pharisees have become so blinded by what's the tradition, what's the way that we've always done it. We've got to have it that way. They become so blinded by that even when something amazingly good is happening right in front of their eyes, they can say, that shouldn't happen. We want to stop it. Do you imagine this? Somebody is crippled, and Jesus heals this guy in front of their eyes. What would you be like if you watched Jesus or anybody, a follower of Jesus, heal someone who was visibly crippled right in front of your eyes Sunday morning at church? How would you react? Or how would you hope or think you would react? Yeah, I mean, you should get really excited about that. And that is how many people, especially the regular people, reacted to Jesus all the time. They were filled with joy and excitement. But in this case, they watched Jesus do that. And because he's breaking their rule, no way. You've done the wrong thing, Jesus. You shouldn't have done it. In fact, they're filled with anger. And they want to figure out a way that they can stop Jesus or harm him, because he's breaking the way that their church has always been. And here's what I want to say at this point, the third point from the third story. Sunday cannot stand in the way of the mission. This is really important. This is important. Remind me of this all the time. You should be reminding me of this. And I am reminding you and myself of this right now. We're saying Jesus is the one. He's the greatest. He's able to save, restore human lives. And we want to join him in that mission. We know that's what he's asked us to do, and that's what we want to do. That's why we do church. That's why we have this time right here, so that people can be restored, brought back to God. They can grow. But Sunday morning itself, it's so easy for this thing that we have on Sunday mornings even to become the thing that stands in the way of fulfilling that mission. If we have Sunday morning every Sunday, even if it's great, even if the music is off the hook like it always is, even if the sermon is like the best sermon you've ever heard like it always is, even if the snacks are the most delicious thing you've ever had. One person recently this was great. One person recently was telling me they were so excited about one of our church events, and they were like, the snacks are so awesome. They're always awesome. That's how you should feel about the snacks. They are always awesome. But even if the snacks are the best thing you've ever had, it's the highlight of your Sunday morning, if that's what happens every week, if people are not growing toward God because of what's happening in here, then we have failed 100% and are not with Jesus at all. He will not he's in church on Sunday morning, Saturday. He's in church on Saturday in this story, and that's what's happening. The church is meeting, and they're doing everything right. They got all their systems down, and people are not being restored. And Jesus is saying, lead follower, get out of the way. You Pharisees should have already been doing this. You've forgotten your whole mission. That's number one. Number two, I'm showing up and I'm actually doing it. And as soon as I try to do this thing, I came for the sick, not for the healthy. I came to call sinners to repentance. And that's what I'm doing. And every time I do it, you come and try to stop me. You guys are out of your minds. You are blind. Jesus is doing it. So he's saying, you should have followed me, Pharisees. You should have been leading this in the first place. And in the second place, as soon as I started doing it, you should have jumped on board with what I'm doing. And you're not. But at the very least, you need to get up, get out of this church, and get out of the way so I can accomplish the mission that I've been sent to do. Pharisees, lead, follow, or get out of the way. And this is what God has been saying to me all week, and what he's saying to you today. Christians, lead. Follow this mission. This is the only thing that's important. As soon as some big, hard thing comes into our culture, if there's a war or a natural disaster or an economic collapse, we're going to see very quickly where the spiritual level of most people is. If they do these kind of things that people are doing right now, all the evil that's in our world, when the tree is green, when everything's nice, everybody has a relatively good place to live, everybody has enough food and enough money for the most part. If people do all the kind of stuff they're doing right now when things are good, what will they do when the tree is dry? What will happen if things collapse? We will see very quickly whether or not the church has been effective, whether or not people actually have a relationship with God. And he's saying to us, lead. You should be doing this. You should be fulfilling this mission. And number two, he's saying to us, if you're not, you should be looking for where I am already fulfilling this mission and jumping on board with it. And please, please don't try to stop me, Jesus is saying. Don't try to stop me if what I'm doing looks different than what you expect it to look like. And hopefully he won't have to say to us, my brothers and sisters in Christ, that we need to get out of the way so he can accomplish his mission. That's my prayer, that he would not have to say that to us. I want to leave you just with this last question to consider, and it's in your handout there, and you can think about it this week. If your life were really all about the mission that Jesus is on, helping people grow in their relationship with God and with each other, restoring human lives, if that was the main point of your life, I'm not saying whether it is or not, that's something for you to consider. If that were really the main point of your life, what would your life look like? Let's pray.